Hello, everybody. Hello. Nice to see you all. And welcome to our Parsha class. This week's Parsha is Parshat Ki Tavo. We're getting close to the end of the Torah. Just a few more Parshot left. And we're also getting close to the end of the year, right? Not a coincidence there. And I am always, when I'm looking at the Torah at this point in the year, I'm always thinking about it as a some kind of reflection point for all of the spiritual work that we're doing to prepare for a new year, to prepare for a season of we begin in this tradition the new year with reflection, with repair, with repentance, with return, lots of our words that are all meant to sketch out the different nuances of the Hebrew word tshuva, repentance. Return is really the most proper translation, but it's all those things. And that's the season, and that's the spiritual energy that we're in. And not every parsha in at the end of the Torah lends itself so easily to those sorts of reflections. And I would say I find Parshat Ki Tavo a particularly difficult parsha, just on its own merits. I always find it difficult to study, and that is because the bulk of the parsha, the biggest aliyah, the biggest piece of the parsha, is the tochacha, the great rebuke. It's the second great rebuke of the Torah. And by rebuke, or tochacha as we call it, we mean it's a threat. It's essentially a threat, but also a kind of a prophecy. If you don't behave, all of these things will happen to you. And it's very, very, very difficult stuff. It's very difficult stuff. I don't like to, none of us, we read it quietly when we come to it in the Torah in shul. There's a tradition to lower one's voice and read it quickly and quietly, which is the tradition's own way of saying, like, ugh, we don't like that this is even here. This is terrible stuff. This is terrible if it is true, and it's also terrible to us that it's in here and that we're being so severely chastised in the middle of our own sacred text. And remember, it happens twice. Okay, so I was going over it and over it. There are interesting, of course, there's always something interesting about every verse in the Torah, but there are really interesting curses in there. There's other things in the parsha. We're going to take a little bit of a running start, but what I ended up stumbling across this week was very, very a verse I'd never noticed before. A very unusual and interesting verse that is stuck buried in the middle of the tochacha, that I think that has all kinds of major implications for our spiritual lives and for how we think about our spiritual work. And I'll just to give one word of teaser. It raises the question of how much our spiritual work ought to be done in joy and happiness. Okay, which I think that is a major question at this season, in part because it's very easy to feel like the spiritual work of Elul and the high holidays is the work of misery, is the work of self-punishment, is the work of feeling terrible about who we are and everything we've done. And we kind of like that isn't the spirit of the age. That isn't the tenor of our culture, and we don't like that message altogether. I find in myself and in my people, but it also, this verse sort of triggered me to a whole investigation that made me think maybe it isn't just that we don't like that message as, modern people or weak people or different people, but actually maybe the Torah the Torah herself is not looking for that kind of religious life from us. Okay, so we'll get there. I just that's a little bit of a preview. Okay, so let's say a blessing, and we'll head into this week's parsha. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so as I said, Parsha Ki Tavo is a difficult one. It starts off though with a beautiful ceremony, and we end up talking about this every year as a way of not talking about the Tochacha, but it starts with Parshat Bikurim, the ceremony of the first fruit. So let's just take a look at the Parsha and see what's in there, and then soon we'll get to the Tochacha. And I guess I also want to do this work with you because knowing about the two Tochachot, the two rebukes, knowing that they're there, knowing their structure, and then beginning to compare one to the other, all of that work is really important work for knowing your Torah. That is, we come across these every year. There are traditions around them. They're there, they're prominent. There are two major rebukes in the Torah. If you're a student of the Torah, at a certain point, whether it's pleasant or not, you have to confront those rebukes and see, why are they there? What is it all about? How do we process these two rebukes? Okay, so let's take a look. Let's start, just to give us a sense of what's in our parsha this week. We'll start at the beginning. And at the beginning, we begin this parsha with, as I said, the first fruit ceremony. There's two kind of ceremonial declarations that begin our parsha, and one is the ceremony of the first fruits. And this is where the parsha gets its name, Ki Tavo. V'haya Ki Tavo, when you enter the land, Ki Tavo. When you enter the land, the Lord your God, the Eternal, is giving you as an inheritance, and you possess it and settle in it. You shall take some of the first fruit of the soil. Mireshit kol pri ha'adama. Right? That's the offering, and you take it and you bring it to the place where your God, the Eternal, will choose to establish, i.e. the temple. And you go to the priest in charge at the time, and you make a declaration. You say to him, I acknowledge, I hereby declare. And there's a whole declaration. It's actually famous, this declaration, especially this part. My father was a fugitive Aramean, and he went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, but there became a great and very populous nation. Very famous because this is in the Haggadah, the Passover Hagada, and it's offered as a kind of like the quickest summary of the story so far. In other words, you go, when you get to the land, you make your first offering, and you go before the priest and you say, I hereby, this is the journey I've taken all along. We wandered all this way. We finally come here. Hooray, hooray. That's Parshat Bikurim. That's the first fruits ceremony. And it's nice. It's nice. There's only so much, I feel like, you can talk about it every year, but there it is. It's nice. First fruit ceremony. It's also nice. This is, okay, so let's just keep track here. Our Parsha begins Deuteronomy Chapter 26. First fruit ceremony, and then we're still in Chapter 26. The next piece is a very similar, very, very similar motion here. It seems like there's two kind of opening ceremonies. The other one discusses the tithe. This doesn't happen. This doesn't happen in the same way in front of a priest, but you do make an offering, a tithe, that is a tenth of your yield, of your produce, and you also make a declaration before God. I've cleared out the consecrated portion from my house. Okay, so that's it. The first fruit and then the tithe, both produce offerings. That's the opening of the parsha, as if to say, okay, when you finally get there, we've been wandering all along, but when you finally get there, go and make offerings and give gratitude to God and tell the priest your story, and it's ceremony. Okay, that's the beginning, but then the rest of the parsha is a series of blessings and curses. And there too, there's kind of two versions of it. One we're not going to look at, which is you may know there's a ceremony that takes place between two mountains, Har Gerizim v'Har Ebal, and people recite curses and blessings to each other. That's complicated, but we'll leave that aside. That is a prelude, though, for, as I said, what ends up taking the majority of the Parsha, which is the tochacha, the rebuke. But the rebuke is in both cases, both back in Leviticus, at the end of the book of Leviticus, and here again in Deuteronomy. In both cases, it starts with some blessings. In other words, the structure is, if you're good, here's a few beautiful blessings that will happen to you. And I say few because in both cases, the blessings that are mentioned are very few. And then it turns and says, but if you're bad, and then explosion, tons and tons and tons. So they were remembered as the rebuke. They're not well balanced in either case. And that's part of the problem. If it were 100 blessings and 100 curses, it would make more sense, but it feels very different. So let's now head into the tochacha. I want to give you the structure that we'll see in both, and then begin to point out some differences between the two. And that finally will set us up to look at the verse in question today. So this is actually the second tochacha, the one in this week, at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, at the end of the Torah. This is our tochacha here, Deuteronomy chapter 28. And we'll go back and we'll look at the other one just for a little comparison. But as I said, it begins by saying, oh, v'haya im shemoa tishma b'kol Hashem Elokecha lishmor lasot et kol mitzvotav asher anochi mitzavcha hayom. If you obey your God, the Eternal, to observe faithfully all the divine commandments which I enjoined upon you this day, your God, the Eternal, will set you high above all the nations of the earth. And all these blessings will come upon you and take effect. And blessed, this is some very poetic language. Baruch atah ba'ir, baruch atah b'sadeh, baruch atah b'vitnecha, ufri admatcha, ufri behemtecha, shgar alafecha, v'ashterot tzonecha, baruch tan'acha, umishartecha, baruch atah b'voecha, baruch atah b'tzeitecha. Blessed shall you be in the city, blessed shall you be in the country, blessed shall be your issue from your womb, your produce from the soil, and the offspring of your cattle, and the calving of your herd, and the lambing of your flock. Blessed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl, blessed shall you be in your comings, and blessed shall you be in your goings. That's great, but it only lasts for 14 verses. There's a few more blessings there. We'll leave that off. But I read all of that so you could hear the parallelism in the curses once they come in verse 15. Here's the turn. Vaya im lo tishma b'kol Hashem Elokecha lishmor lasot et kol mitzvotav v'chukotav asher anochi mitzavcha hayom. But if you do not obey your God the Eternal to observe faithfully all the commandments and laws which I enjoined upon you this day, all these curses shall come upon you and take effect. Cursed shall you be in the city, and cursed shall you be in the country. Cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Cursed arur, cursed shall be the issue of your womb, and your produce in the soil, and the calving of your herd, and the lambing of your flock. Arur tabavorecha, va'arur tabetzetecha. Cursed shall you be in your comings, and cursed shall you be in your goings. Parallel language there, but gosh, then we just keep going. And the blessings were 14 verses long. The curses will be, when we get to the bottom of them, 55 verses long, okay, 69 altogether. So let's just to give you a sense of some of what's in here. Here's one of the most striking images in the curse section. The Eternal will strike you with madness, blindness, and dismay. You shall grope at noon as the blind grope in the dark. You shall not prosper in your ventures, but shall be constantly abused and robbed with none to give help. Really, really terrible, difficult, theologically challenging stuff, that God would do this at all, that we might deserve it. Just so unpleasant, so horrible to read. And then finally, it ends with, the Eternal will scatter you among all the peoples from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve other gods, wood and stone, whom neither you nor your ancestors have experienced. And even among those nations you shall find no peace, nor shall your foot find a place to rest. The Eternal will give you there an anguished heart and eyes that pined and a despondent spirit. The life you face shall be precarious. You shall be in terror night and day with no assurance of survival. In the morning you shall say, if only it were evening. And in the evening you shall say, if only it were morning. Because of what your heart shall dread and your eyes shall see. Okay. So, one more verse. The Eternal shall send you back to Egypt in galleys by a route which I told you should not see again. And there you shall offer yourselves for sale to enemies as male and female slaves, but none will buy. And that's it. It ends there. These are the terms of the covenant which God commanded Moses to conclude with the Israelites. It's almost like the Torah ends there. There's a little more story after that, but it's like that. It's sort of the last word of the covenant there. Terrible. Okay. Now, I just want to point out 3 differences between this tochacha and the tochacha back in Leviticus, and by pointing out those 3, that'll give us some opportunity to think about why these are here all together. But as I said, eventually we're gunning for one particular verse, and we'll get there with the 3rd difference. Okay. The first difference between the tochacha in the book of Leviticus, the earlier tochacha, and the tochacha in the book of Deuteronomy that everybody notices is that the tochacha in the book of Leviticus is said in the, what is it called? First person plural. And the tochacha in the book of Deuteronomy is said in the first person singular. In other words, back there, the tochacha is addressed to the whole people of Israel, y'all. And here, it seems to be directed, Moses is speaking as if he's speaking to you, singular. So let's just take a look at that. Just take note of that. Okay, so here it is in Deuteronomy now. If you obey the Eternal your God, which I enjoin upon you, and it's most clear, right? You in English works both ways, but blessed shall you be, Baruch atah, you, not atem, but atah. Blessed shall you be. And so it is with all of the verbs and the possessive. Tzonecha, your sheep, you, singular. Okay. Whereas the curses in Leviticus, see, they follow the same structure. If you follow my laws, that's great. But if you don't, then there's bad stuff to come. But the you here is different. It's telechu, tishmeru, you all. Okay. So that's first of all that's one difference to think about. When I say that we should think about the difference between the tochacha in Leviticus and the tochacha in Deuteronomy, we're always doing comparative study in our readings of the Torah. But remember the primary rule when we come to the book of Deuteronomy. What's the primary reading rule when we come to the book of Deuteronomy? Said it several times in this class before. Deuteronomy is Moses's book. Moses was the prophet through which the entire Torah came, but tradition tells us, and the way the story is, even in the book of Deuteronomy, is told that Deuteronomy is more Moses's voice than any of the rest of the Torah. Moses gave this over himself, right? It came up out of him. It's his tochacha. So one way to think about any comparison that we do between Leviticus or anything else before the book of Deuteronomy and the book of Deuteronomy is that somehow Moses made that choice to point the finger at you and you and you and you and you and not y'all. Okay, so that's one difference. Another striking difference, another if a sad difference one feels between the two tochachot is that the first one ends with, right, terrible stuff here. I'll wreak misery upon you, consumption and fever. I'll set my face against you. Your foes shall dominate you. But the first one ends with words of consolation. Yet even then, when they're in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them or spurn them entirely, so as to destroy them, annulling my covenant with them. No, for I, the Eternal, am their God. I will remember in their favor the covenant with the ancients, whom I freed from the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations to be their God. I, the Eternal. These, right, okay. So ends on a good note. Like, yes, there's a lot of curses, but in the end, it'll all work out. I will remember you. Some kind of, we will repair the breach. And remember, we just read the other curse, tochacha, which ends on this terrible note of going back into slavery. Right? The Moses who took them out of slavery, his last sort of word of rebuke is to say, and if you're not careful, you're going to go back to Egypt. Okay. So that's difference two. Tochacha 1 addressed to y'all and ends on a good note. Tochacha 2 addressed to you singular and ends on a terrible note. Okay. Here, it's like thinking there are lots of differences. We could keep going. You know, what's in there? One is longer than the other. Lots of differences. But I was like looking around for anybody who has had anything to say on the two tochachot, and I found a really interesting third difference pointed out by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory, who died, I think, within the last year or within the last 2 years, maybe, I think it was. Certainly one of the great, he's so famous for being like, the Queen has died in England, but when Jonathan Sachs passed away, that was sort of like our royalty dying in England, right? Like he's famous for being the chief rabbi of England, and he was a dignitary in many ways, and very eloquent, very, very worldly, very, well-educated in both realms, as, an English chief rabbi is supposed to be. But he really was a great scholar. And when you read his writing, he's incredibly, incredibly insightful. And I do think he will be remembered in the long term as one of the great commentators of our age, because he has a great collection of Torah commentary, and it's called Covenant and Conversation. Often says really, has real chidushim, real new insights. And he suggests something here that I'd never thought of before, and also that finally brings us to this verse in question, okay, that I want, the rest of the class will be a reflection on this verse. So here's what he says, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. He says, in Bechukotai, that's back in Leviticus, God had spoken of a fundamental breach between Israel and its Redeemer. The language is harsh. If you reject my decrees and abhor my laws, if you continue to be hostile to me, what is at stake is an active rebellion of the Israelites against God. That's back there in Leviticus. In Kitavo, here in Deuteronomy, the language is entirely different. It does not speak of a willful, petulant nation deliberately spurning God. Indeed, it speaks of something that hardly sounds like a sin at all. Why would Israel suffer? Because you did not serve God, your Lord, with joy and gladness in the midst of the abundance of all. Okay, I'll read that one more time. Why would Israel suffer? Because you did not serve God, your Lord, with joy and gladness in the midst of the abundance of all. Okay, that's really an interesting suggestion, that maybe the earlier rebuke is focused on the people's rebellion against God, some animosity between them and God, rejection of the covenant, bad behavior. And the second tochacha centers on, according to Rabbi Sachs, this idea that we didn't do it with joy. We didn't serve God out of a sense of joy. We didn't, once we had what we needed, we stopped being happy about it. We got too comfortable with in the midst of abundance. All right, and let's just show you that verse, and then I want to open up finally the conversation here. What you think this verse could possibly be saying? Why is it here, and how seriously should we take it? Because I have to admit that when I went back and I looked at the verse in the Torah, Rabbi Sachs, it seems like not exactly as strong stark a contrast as Rabbi Sachs was suggesting. Because if you go back to the Torah, you find all these curses shall befall you, and they shall pursue you and overtake you until you're wiped out, because you did not heed your God, the Eternal. So you didn't heed your God, the Eternal, and keep the commandments and laws that were enjoined upon you. Okay, so that's a similar message, right? You didn't listen to God, you didn't do what God said. That is also there, or it isn't as clearly not, but what did Rabbi Sachs said? It does not speak of a willful, petulant nation deliberately spurning God, but I don't know, sort of does, doesn't it? And not only that, but when we get to the verse in question, it says, because you would not serve your God, the eternal, in joy and gladness in the midst of the abundance of all, it actually seems like the next verse continues the thought and says, therefore you shall have to serve in hunger and thirst, naked and lacking everything, the enemies whom the eternal will let loose against you. So it's sort of like another curse, right? Because you didn't serve joy, you're going to end up, let's keep the formula carefully in our minds. Because you didn't serve God with joy when you had everything you needed, then you will serve God in a state of hunger and starvation eventually. Okay, so I'm not sure when I go back that actually Rabbi Sachs is exactly right, that the whole thing is not about the people's rebellion, it's about their lack of joy. But, so we'll continue to think about that, but I am intrigued by the idea. I'm intrigued by the idea, and I want to discuss with you the idea that Moses is focused in the second rebuke, especially on the possibility that the people will get self-satisfied and abundant and full, and they will stop feeling any joy, and that they will not serve God in joy, and that will be the problem. That'll be the central problem. Okay, so I already see some folks wanting to respond to that. So let's just pause there and contemplate a little bit what that verse might mean, and how central it might be, this statement that Moses is making, that there's a real problem with you people who get to a place where you don't serve God out of joy. All right, so let's hear some first responses to that. Elizabeth?
I just think it's the normal fact that when everything is okay, you don't even think about God, and you don't think about serving, and you don't, because everything's hunky-dory in your life. And it's the punishment for having forgotten and just turning to God when things are bad is, you know what, now you're going to be punished, because that's not the idea. The idea is to be gracious and grateful when things are good. So that, I think, encompasses part of the punishment, is that you forgot to do that.
Yeah, okay, good. Elizabeth's comments are really brucha shekivant. I mean, Elizabeth is really filling out the argument that Rabbi Sachs makes, which is that it is actually abundance which is the pitfall, that when we have too much, that's precisely when we start to become spiritually lazy, self-satisfied. It's that Rabbi Sachs actually, you know what? Let's take a look at what he says. I have it here. I will say I'm not sure I was entirely comfortable with what Rabbi Sachs said here. It's quite, there's something about it that I find very challenging. But let's fill out that idea a little bit, because Elizabeth teed it up for us so nicely here. Let's see if I can produce that for us. Here it is. Okay, I'm gonna play a little bit with the format of Sefaria here and see if I can just enter something in mid. Okay, here's Rabbi Sachs, right? You did not serve the Lord your God with gladness in the midst of it all. And the greatest challenge, he said, is not slavery, but freedom. I mean, that's a weird thing to say, you know, not poverty, but affluence, not danger, but security, not homelessness, but home. The paradox is that when we have most to thank God for, that's when we are in greatest danger of not thanking, nor even of thinking of God at all. I want to just stop here and say, you read those words and it sounds like, oh, have you ever tried being poor? But I think he's saying the greatest challenge to our spiritual lives in particular. I don't think he's dismissing the challenge of being poor or being a slave, but that he's saying something, it's an insight worth considering, that sometimes it is those who are suffering most that are most able to access their connection to God. And it's wealth and abundance actually that can be a kind of a block to that. Here, just finish the thought here. And so it was throughout the almost unbearable centuries of exile, the wanderings, expulsions, forced conversions, and autos of faith, through ghettos and pogroms, Jews prayed to God, studied his word, kept his commandments, handed on his message to their children, and held fast to their identity as Jews with a tenacity awesome in its strength. Jews were a God-intoxicated people. It was only when equality beckoned, when a society opened its doors, when at last Jews were no longer what Max Weber called a pariah people, that they abandoned their faith. Okay, very challenging stuff. I fear but even by quoting that, I'm gonna like open up the conversation too far. We're gonna take us astray. But I want to try to return us back to the point that Elizabeth was making, and that I think Rabbi Sachs is making, which is there is a problem with having too much, and it's great in terms of your physical well-being, but it can cause you to become spiritually lazy, detached, forgetful, oversated. Okay, so that's one approach to the problem and to the worry that Moses has. All right, let's continue to hear others. Noah?
Yeah, Rabbi Sachs and the Torah make an interesting point, but there's not really a chance for tshuva, for repentance, that once you're in abundance, you're never thanking God for anything, but where's the chance to thank God? It's not there, doesn't seem to be there, that we're in this abundance, or even not in abundance, where there's no chance for repentance. And especially in this time of Elul, where's the chance for tshuva?
That's really interesting. Okay, and that also, I think, echoes theologies that you will find throughout Jewish history, which is that there's some question as to why we struggle at all, but not just our suffering. I mean, just like, why do we have to struggle through just to like keep ourselves alive? Why would God want us like and all the animals running around trying to? I watch nature shows with my parents a lot. That's one of the things we do together, and it's like we love watching them. It's just like, we just love watching the natural world in motion, but mostly what it's in motion doing is just looking for food. That's all the animals do, right? They mate and they eat. They just satisfy their life needs. And one of the answers to why is everything in constant search to fulfill its needs is that's the way that it's set up, because we need to be in a position of knowing that we don't have it all, that we need help, we need assistance, we need to that we need to know that what we get is a blessing. So every time we get hungry, we have a new opportunity to remember that it's such a blessing that there's food. If I didn't need food, sooner or later, I just wouldn't be aware of the fact that in itself is a blessing, that I need no sustenance, but it's one that I would forget. So I need to be in a relationship of dependency to to God, to the world, to everything around me, in order to know that I am not perfect as I am, right? Because if I start to feel that, then like there's no need for God or prayer. I am God, I'm fine, right? So that's not to say that we celebrate hunger, but to say that there's a reason for the whole cycle of dependence that the entire world participates in. Great. Okay, Alexandra?
I'm wondering if this might speak to Noah's point about tshuva and the opportunity for finding our way back from these curses. What I remember, and I don't know if it's in these curses or maybe other ones, but that there is sort of a map back afterwards, which is if we learn to love it all, and I'm misquoting, but if we learn to love it all and love God, we'll find our way back to God, and God will re-embrace us. And to me, this conversation reminds me about several classes ago when we talked about fear of God being the first step on the journey to loving God. And this book was given to people who had no concept of God. And so they really had to be taught to scare God into being taught to follow the path towards loving God. So in
I
that,
love yeah.
Oh, and just to speak to a point that you made towards the beginning of class, that Elul is often a sort of a hard and a tough, and we're sort of hard on ourselves. And that's one way, and that's a good way. And there's also, I think there's also opportunity to celebrate this spiritual work as the path back to God, and to, as maybe Rabbi Jonathan Sachs was talking about, maybe I'm missing the point, but it's an opportunity to celebrate this time of inner reflection and celebrate this spiritual work as a joyful process. As hard as it is a path back to God and to loving God and each other.
Great. I love the way you've tied it back to this work that we're doing right now, this Elul work, this pre-New Year work, because it's the cycle that we've just described. We use food as an example, right, of having to constantly refeed yourself. The link that you're helping us make, Alexandra, is that cycle should feel like our tshuva cycle also. In other words, why do we have to do tshuva? Why do we have to return to God every year? Didn't we return to God last year? Right? Maybe I just stayed there. But no, I didn't stay there. Because, we always have to return. We always drift away and come back. That's the nature of things. And I think what Alexandra was doing so nicely was reminding us that Moses is talking to a people who have a very different relationship with God than we do. God was like hovering above them, you know what I mean? There all the time, really present, had liberated them, had spoke to one of them. God was and so Moses is saying, it's not always going to be this way. It's eventually you're not always going to be wandering slaves. Eventually you're going to be a people who have things, and that's great. It's a blessing, but the blessing has within it certain perils. Watch for those things, right? Because we drift away. And that's why we have to come back every year and remind ourselves, oh, right. I lived another year. That in itself is a blessing. I take that for granted. And the fact that I have a roof over my head, my God, I should be so grateful for that at every minute, but I can't. It wouldn't even I'm not even sure it'd be that meaningful if I just stared at my roof all day long, like, wow, isn't that great? You know what I mean? So it's got to be a cycle. Okay, beautiful. Leah Matsui.
I think we get inundated in sort of a Christian modality. Do good, get good. Do bad, get bad. Our heroes are pure and strong, Dudley do right, and our villains are indeed villainous. But that's not somehow the way it works for us. There's something greater that seems to be going on that is often unfathomable. We get the freedom to choose at every moment whether to celebrate or not. And sometimes it's really hard to remember that their joy would be possible even in this moment. But I think that that's what's being held out to us as a possibility. You could sing and dance and celebrate even on your way out, even in the absolute worst situations.
Okay, that also seems to me like a good way of identifying one of Moses's concerns here, which is not just that you can become forgetful and complacent is the word, right? That's the word that's been eluding me. Complacent when you have too much, but that the idea is that you can be miserable with anything and you can be joyful with anything. Now, again, I think to say that is immediate. Certainly almost everybody, when I said that, thought, well, wait a minute. I can think of a situation where you can't be joyful, right? Like it's an important paradigm which has some asterisks around it, right? But maybe that's what the Torah is pushing us towards, is some idea that we could cultivate joy in the midst of any kind of suffering, And we could cultivate misery in the midst of any kind of abundance. And the idea is not that it's better to be poor than rich. It's better to be endangered than safe. But the idea is like, don't let those two states be the determinants of your consciousness, because we can cultivate this joy in the midst of everything. Okay, I want to use that comment to open the verse up a little bit into seeing how it's been used by we saw Rabbi Sachs take it up, but it's been used again and again, this verse. Once he pointed it out to me, I went back and looked it up and saw how the verse recurs again and again in all kinds of works of kind of spiritual development. And Maimonides mentions it, Yehuda Levi mentions it, but the very striking mention in the Tanya, one of the great Hasidic works I happen to be reading a lot lately as I prepare for the high holidays, and he quotes this verse. So here's a couple of very famous Hasidic masters and their emphasis on this verse. Remember, the Hasidic movement is known for its emphasis on joy in the service of God. That's almost defining. So yes, joy in the service of God, but that sounds like such a nice, friendly, easy thing to say. But actually, often in the formulation, it sounds much more like the way Leah was just putting it, which is that you have to work to be joyful in spite of it all. So here's just a couple of examples of that. Here's the Tanya, the founder of the Chabad Hasidic movement. And he says the Torah is, he's talking about the need for joy in the service of God. And he says the Torah is explicit on this point, because you would not serve your God, the eternal, in joy. That's sorry, I should have a quote there. Because you would not serve your God, the eternal, in joy. That's our verse. And everyone knows that the Arizal spoke about this verse as well. Lots of people speaking about this verse. And the proper advice from all these people is to cleanse one's heart of all sadness and of every trace of worry about mundane matters, even about children, health, and sustenance. Now, these are the things that you ought to be worrying about, right? Children, health, and sustenance. I mean, are we really being told that we shouldn't worry about these things? What does he mean by that? I was reminded of what he says next when Leah was talking, because he says, everyone's familiar with the statement of the rabbis that just as one must recite a blessing for the good, one must also recite a blessing for misfortune. In the Gemara, in the Talmud, it is explained that one should accept misfortune with joy, like the joy of a visible and obvious benefit, for Gamzula Tova. This is also for the good, except that it's not apparent and visible to mortal eyes because it stems from the hidden world, which is higher than the revealed world. Okay, that's mysticism right there. What he means exactly by that, I don't know, but the point is well taken. You don't always see the good, but you have to work to see the good. Sometimes when you're having health problems, you still have to work to see the good. Work to see the good. Okay, and nobody puts that more firmly and strongly than another great Hasidic master, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. One of his most famous teachings, one of his most central teachings, is mitzvah gadola liot b'simcha tamid. It's a great mitzvah, a great commandment to be happy always. Great commandment to be happy always. And you know what? Now that we've seen this verse in the Torah, he might be right. We're actually commanded to be happy, right, in our service of God. Here, though, I never tire of once I saw this, I never tire of reminding people that he says mitzvah gadola liot b'simcha tamid. It is a great commandment to be happy always, and to strengthen oneself to push away the sadness and the black bitterness with all of one's might. Whoa. Okay. So it wasn't so simple, was it? It's not so simple. It's a great message to be happy all the time, always be happy. We're saying it seems impossible. And it doesn't actually look like it's being treated like a simple matter. Right? You have to somehow fight for this. This might be the most difficult work of all, is trying to find joy in the midst of abundance or of suffering. Both of those states of the world is full. You could have everything and be miserable. You could certainly have nothing and be miserable. How do we find joy in the midst of that all? How do we do that? I mean, that's a difficult question. So let me turn back to the group and see what you're thinking. Either Larry or I don't know who has the Zuckermans.
It's the Laura that's going to speak.
Laura will speak. Okay. Hi, Laura.
Hi, thank you. Everyone has made very thought-provoking comments. And so I guess I want to point out that elsewhere in the Tanakh, we see evidence of what happens when kings of Judah ignore Moses's warning. And so once they have amassed wealth and won battles, they're busy worshiping the Baals. So that sense of complacency, that sense of having enough. But I want to turn it a little bit in the mystical direction to say, much of this depends on the definition of the things we're speaking of, as though we know what they are and we all agree on them. So for example, we all apparently agree on what's joyful, and we all apparently agree on what's suffering. Now, I don't think that's true. And so I just want to say, perhaps what we're looking at here is a failure to see in depth what is being referred to, and in a fairly spiritual or mystical way, which is to say, if we have a problem of having too much of what? And I think that we've all been speaking as though there's only one thing to have too much of, and that's material things. But there's alternatives there. I don't, I'm not wise enough to name them for you. I can think of a few for myself, but there are some alternatives contained within that. And then finally, I would say, to be in relationship with God Moses may suggest, in what's implicit here is to recalculate. That is to say, to have different standards, not the standards that we take for granted. Do we have enough food? Do we have, enough wealth? Do we have enough material items? All of these things we are presuming lead to happiness. I don't know if anyone here has ever had that experience.
Good. These comments are all extremely helpful and problematizing. Helpful in that they're problematizing. And that is, I think I understand Laura's central point in several different ways, to be that what we're talking about here, what we seem to be talking about, is it exists within an extremely subjective realm. Once we're talking about states of well-being or joy, well, as Laura points out, different people are joyous about different things and joyous in different ways. How do we measure such a thing? How do we command such a thing that seems to exist only in my own heart, my own self-knowledge? Or does the Torah presume that there is some objective joy? And if so, what would that mean? What would that look like? Right? So that's right. I mean, if indeed this is as central as Rabbi Sachs suggests that it is in the Tochacha here, if it's as central in our service of God as the Balatanya or Rabbi Nachman says that it is, well, how do I know that I'm doing that? That I'm happy? Am I happy enough? What does it mean to be happy? And how do I get myself there? It's an easy thing to say, but it's a very difficult thing to define. And that problem is just a problem that we deal with in our everyday cultural conversations. A lot of energy, a lot of books, a lot of talks, a lot of conferences centered around the idea of finding happiness, of becoming happy, of figuring out how to be happy. And at the center of all that is a state of emotional inner life that is very difficult to define or measure, right? So here, the word that we are using is simcha and tov lev, right? Good happiness or joy, simcha, and then goodness of heart, tov lev. Your heart is good. Okay, so right. So what exactly do we mean by these things? We certainly won't be able to give precise definitions in the next few minutes, but it's important to keep that question in mind as well. All right, let's try to hear from a few more folks before we close. Kathy Kobayashi.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the things that I keep coming back to in my mind is this whole move from the plural to the singular. So that the Deuteronomy, focusing on the singular, one.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. The one thing that occurs to me is that, is it saying in a sense that abundance is a particular problem in an individualistic sort of society, or is it saying that actually abundance engenders a kind of sort of individual concerns or a separation of individuals from community? It could go kind of either way, but it seems to me that it does seem to be a part of the kind of argument, because if there are perils in abundance, which we've been talking about, and whether they in fact cause people to be separated off into the singularity, or whether it's just another kind of circumstance. The thing is that it's really much harder to engender joy as an isolated individual. That so much of what we think of as being joy is connection and community and beyond the singular to the plural. And so anyway, that's
really insightful. I like that connection back to a distinction we considered earlier, to this idea Kathy weaves so well us back to this idea that the one of the differences is that Moses is addressing in the you singular, you. And I love Kathy's question, this wondering whether the problem here, the problem of sort of self-satisfaction, is a problem of the self, of an overemphasis on the self, and that Moses is worried about how it is that an individual can become so wrapped up in their own self, in their own lives, in their own misery, in their own, right? Wondering then more broadly about like where does joy fall in the life of the individual, and where does it fall in the life of the community? These are also important questions to be considering as we begin to wrap up this conversation. I want to point out one more thing before we do, and then I'll see if we have time for further comments. But Kathy's comments just now remind me that once again, that it's Moses talking. And that's interesting, right? That this, if we're going to say that this tochacha has this new emphasis on serving God with joy, it's interesting to consider that might be an emphasis that Moses wanted in there, that it wasn't in there before. And I went and looked it up, as I want to do, and it's actually quite striking. If you look up the word simcha, or all the versions of simcha that you can find in the Torah, there are four total mentions of the word before the book of Deuteronomy, and there are 12 mentions of it in the book of Deuteronomy. That's interesting. That's not like nothing before and all of a sudden, but it's interesting. Like it existed before, but Moses does seem to have a particular concern with simcha, with serving God in joy. And you know what? We saw one of those mentions at the beginning of the Parsha, right? That we saw this earlier when we looked at the first fruits. We looked at the first fruit of your soil, remember? And you acknowledged and you said to God, my father was a wandering Aramean, and on and on and on. And then it says, you shall leave it before your God the Eternal and bow low before your God the Eternal, and you shall rejoice, v'samachta, together with the family of the Levite and the stranger in your midst, and all the bounty that your God the Eternal has bestowed upon you and your household. V'samachta, right? And even in that other mention of the tithe, I have not eaten of it while in mourning. Lo achalti ba'oni. Okay, so that's interesting. And v'samachta b'chagecha, v'ayita ach sameach, all of that is in the book of Deuteronomy. So that's interesting. Moses does seem to be particularly concerned, if this is Moses's book, with this concept of joy in divine service. Okay, and the only thing that I want to say about that before I throw it back to you for some final comments is that That's really interesting because Moses, of all people, did not seem like a particularly simchadik kind of guy. Right? That's interesting. Not that he was, I don't know, he was sad, but he was certainly dour. I mean, the guy, and why not? He had such a hard life. He had such a hard life. Such a hard life, as did most of these people that he's speaking to, right? So interesting that Moses would say, remember that when we get what we're praying for, when we get across the Jordan to the other side, when we are growing produce, when we have it all, we're going to forget to be happy. We're going to forget to be grateful. We're going to forget God at all. And all of this suffering, it's been hard, but it keeps us connected, right? It keeps us connected. So let's just think about the figure of Moses on our way out as we consider who it is that is yearning for joy in their divine service. Who it is that is keenly aware of what it means to be in the divine service and is yearning for joy in that experience. Okay, let's see, time for one more. Yonatan Reches. No Yonatan. Julia Bird.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, we hear you.
Hello. Yeah.
We never get to see you, Yonatan.
I know. Yeah. I wish you could. Thank you for this great lesson. I really wanted to build on Kathy's comment where she said that joy is a communal enterprise. It's also really important that in Judaism, intention doesn't exist in your heart, strangely enough. It exists in your actions. That's the real metric of intention. And so when I think about like worshiping God with joy, I mean, to me, Ikar is like such a great example of that. You go into shul and everyone's there for each other, right? And like gets into the joy of praying. That doesn't necessarily mean they've got no problems in their life. So sometimes you go into a shul and everyone's just kind of, mumbling along because they feel like they're obligated to, and there's no joy behind their prayer. And to me, I mean, I don't know what troubles people are going through when they're davening beside me, but when everyone is worshiping God with joy, that affects me and my state of being and my state of worship, right? So there is an element here of like being there for each other and supporting one another.
I love that. Thank you, Yonatan. That is a very, very helpful response to a question that was raised just earlier. A really difficult question, which is how we might measure joy altogether, or how do we account for what does it mean to know whether we are joyous or not? One answer to the question Yonatan gives, and I think it's a classic answer, not classic like I know who else has said it, but classically Jewish, which is that the emphasis in this tradition is on action. Your inner states of being, well, it's hard to say what that means, but there are ways to show that you love God. There are ways to show that you're in awe of God, and there are ways to show that you are rejoicing. How are you misamech? How do you provide joy? How do you feel joy yourself? Well, do these things, dance, get up, participate. Right? Be with the community in its times. And Kathy was alluding to this also, that maybe we need the community, we need each other. Hey, you and you and you and you individuals, we're going to need each other together. Don't separate yourself off into individuals, because we need each other to create these ceremonies and mechanisms for facilitating joy in our divine service. That's a great answer. That's one of the answer to a question that we need to keep asking. But in the meantime, we'll close our discussion today. I want to close with Alexandra's a very, I think, important reminder that this work that we are doing in the month of Elul, which can be this kind of heart-beating work, this heart-pounding work, and then on into the month of Tishrei, it's difficult stuff. It's difficult stuff. Life is difficult. Religion is difficult. There's a lot of difficulty in the world, but we are going to try to remember that this too can be done with joy. We can beat our chests with joy. We can remember our sins with joy. We can do all of this with joy because we know that what we're doing is we're coming back to who we are. We're returning to who we are. We're growing. We're developing. We're getting closer to God, and it's tough, but we're heading somewhere, and that in itself is a source of great joy. And to be able to do it together allows us to facilitate that awareness. So may we feel joy in our work as we head towards the new year. It's good learning with you all, and we'll see you again next week.